explanation of the resolution today that public figures have a moral obligation to advocate against injustice. This is going to be a value round, and the value that you're going to be weighing this on is going to be quality of life. So whoever in this round is upholding quality of life for the most amount of people is who you're going to be voting for today. So just to get into some definitions to clarify things for the round, a public figure, according to Merriam-Webster, is going to be an individual or entity that has acquired fame or notoriety. So for example, politicians, celebrities, or any other influential leaders. Moral obligation from U.S. legal forums refers to a duty that arises from considerations of right and wrong. Advocate from Oxford is going to be to publicly recommend or support. And to supplement that from Cambridge, someone who supports a group of people who may need extra help or protection. And then finally, injustice from Merriam-Webster refers to a lack of fairness or justice or a violation of the rights of another. Pretty straightforward definitions, so let's just go ahead and get right into my first contention, which is going to be moral obligation. First, let me explain to you where this moral obligation is even coming from. Subpoint A is going to be marginalized communities are suffering. This almost goes without saying, but injustices in our society, not only America, but globally, are so pervasive right now. Just to give you a few, PMC tells you that racial and ethnic minorities suffer disproportionately in health and criminal justice related outcomes. The U.S. Department of Treasury, it tells you that economic inequality is rampant right now. CDC tells us that millions of women and LGBTQ individuals are subject to preventable violence and trauma from sexual assault. These are just a few things to name of the injustices that are going on, but the list goes on and on and on. So clearly, there is a need to help these people right now because this issue is so rampant. But subpoint B is going to be public figures specifically. So why do public figures have this moral obligation to address these rampant injustices? Because Oxford Practical Ethics in 2020 tells us that public figures have amplified influence that generates special moral obligations because their actions affect social outcomes far more than the actions of the ordinary person. And Rawls' theory of justice supplements this by telling us that those with the greater capacity to affect institutions bear greater duties of justice. More than that, the UN tells us that silence by influential actors legitimizes injustices and suppresses public pressure for reform. And finally, Harvard supplements this by saying that elite cues shift public behavior significantly. So we can see here that public figures do indeed have the power to make a difference, and I will explain this a little bit more in my second contention, which is that advocacy works. Subpoint A is going to be hate crimes and violence. According to FBI and Georgetown in 2021, hate crimes fall 12 to 18% in the months after major political or cultural leaders publicly condemn racist or extremist incidents. For example, President Biden's condemnation of anti-Asian violence in 2021 led to a 17% decrease in anti-Asian hate incidents. More than that, the FBI crime report tells us that public condemnation of anti-LGBTQ rhetoric in 2021 led to an 11% decrease in reported anti-LGBTQ hate crimes. So we can see here how when public figures are speaking out against these injustices and extremist incidents, we are actually seeing a direct decrease in these hate crimes and these violent incidents, showing you that advocacy by these public figures works. But subpoint B is going to be discriminatory behavior. Advocacy also leads to a decrease in this discriminatory behavior. So from Harvard Kennedy in 2021, they tell us that statements from high-profile figures reduce discriminatory behavior by 23% in controlled community experiments. The CDC in 2022 tells us that when public figures spoke out about domestic violence, it led to a 22% increase in awareness about hotlines and survivor services. Forgive me. So you can see here that when public figures speak out, not only are they leading to this decrease in discriminatory behavior, but we are seeing people gain more awareness about these injustices and figure out access to resources to help themselves after they face these traumas. But finally, subpoint C under this is protecting democracy. According to Freedom House, countries where influential actors publicly condemn injustices show significantly slower rates of democratic erosion and lower long-term political polarization. What is this showing you? That when public figures are speaking out against injustice, this literally reduces political polarization and lowers the rates of democratic erosion. We can see an example of this in Eastern Europe, where public figures speaking out against authoritarianism reduce support for anti-democratic parties by 10 to 15 points. So we can clearly see here how when public figures speak out against injustices going on, this is also strengthening and protecting democracy. So Judge, when you're looking at today's round, the reason you're going to be signing your ballot for the affirmative here today is because we have shown you, one, that this moral obligation indeed does exist. Not only are moral obligations that they don't always fulfill, so don't let my opponent get away with conflating that every single public figure in the entire world must do this. It's not a policy round. I'm not forcing them to do this. Having a moral obligation doesn't necessitate doing this, but the AF is advocating for as many public figures as they should be doing this because of the benefits. Now let's get into the net case. First, my opponent says like public figures need to retain their individual rights and autonomy. One, just go ahead and like apply the concept I just tell you of like not every public figure is going to like have to do this. It's not like a mandate by law that the AF is recommending. But more than that, the examples my opponent even brings up, if anything, is going to be a turn for the affirmative. Serena Williams literally has one of the most successful careers ever, one of the most well-known athletes ever, and speaks out against injustices all the time. It's a perfect example of what the AF is advocating for. But next, my opponent brings up this idea of like child actors. Judge, my opponent again is trying to like misconstrue this round in its entirety. Like child actors is a small subset of the population. Public figures on average, we're talking about politicians, we're talking about like celebrities, and yes, like child actors is like one little facet of it, but on majority, we're talking about like the rest of them, okay? I'm not forcing like minors to do things they don't want. Next, my opponent says these issues are subjective, and like people have subjective like takes on like political issues. But Judge, these are not political issues. Injustices should not be conflated with political issues when we're telling you things like sexual assault, which my opponent concedes are very straightforward like interpretations. Of hate crimes, straightforward interpretations. Like ethnic minorities suffering disproportionately, that's a straightforward interpretation. Like there's not like that much objectivity like on average. But next, my opponent says like advocacy is not always effective. And Judge, literally, one, cross-apply everything I'm telling you. I'm giving you real stats of like actual like percentages of how much hate crimes are going down and like democracy is being protected, etc., etc. My opponent tells you about Colin Kaepernick. Again, a term for the affirmative. While he like may have like regretted kneeling right then and there, he is still a perfect example of advocacy, and people are talking about his actions even now, and the strength and bravery he showed that day is discussed even now, showing you how like this is, again, a term for the affirmative and how public figures should be doing this. But then, on the responses to the affirmative case, the only response we're getting on this first subpoint is like, oh, like, yes, there are these issues, but we don't say why we should. You know why? Because the entire like subpoint B is not really interacted with, explaining to you that Oxford specifically says because public figures have amplified influence, that they have like the capacity and the moral obligation to help. So they say like we don't show you why like they should. Yes, we do. The sources do that. They just don't interact with them. And then again, like they just say like silence by influential actors means that they can never be silent. Again, like people ignore moral obligations. While I want as many public figures to take this on as they can, like you can still be silent and have a moral obligation. But more than that, they use Miss Rachel as the example. Miss Rachel is literally one of like the greatest advocates I've ever seen for a celebrity. I love her so much. But then on my second contention, the only response is like, again, they shouldn't have to, but I've already explained that several times in this speech. So thank you to my judge for being here, thank you to my opponent for being here, and thank you to my dad for being here. Let's get right into it. So I'll just respond to their voters and then give you some of my own. First, on this idea of individual rights and liberties. My opponent specifically says that these people don't want to have to do this. Judge, I want you to look at your flow right now. Has my opponent even given you an example of anyone that actually does not want to do this aside from maybe Tom Hanks? All the examples of Colin Kaepernick, Miss Rachel, and Serena Williams are all people who want to speak out. My opponent doesn't give you any stats, any numbers on the amount of celebrities that say they don't want to speak out aside from one. And when I told you at the beginning of the round that the weighing mechanism is quality of life for the most amount of people, they haven't even shown you how many people are being harmed by this moral obligation. But next on subjectivity, my opponent literally conceded in cross that these are issues that are like overall agreed upon. Sexual assault, hate crimes being bad, these things being bad are not subjective, they're very straightforward, and if my opponent thinks so, that's a really problematic take. But next, on their third one of advocacy is not always effective, again, look at your flow. I give you quantifiable numbers showing you how advocacy is effective. One example of it backfiring, and that example being Colin Kaepernick, which only supports the AF, is not going to give my opponent the W today. But lastly, on this point about, again, like backfiring, yeah, I just said that. Okay, now, the AF voters. First voter here today is going to be quality of life. Again, at the beginning of this round, I said that how you are going to be voting is that you are going to see who helps quality of life for the most amount of people. When I'm telling you that advocacy is leading to a 17% decrease in anti-Asian American hate crimes, an 11% decrease in LGBTQ hate crimes, a 23% decrease in discriminatory behavior, a 22% increase in awareness of hotlines and suicide behavior, you are going to be saying that the affirmative world is the one that is helping the most amount of people or improving the quality of life for the most amount of people. And that alone is reason for you to be voting for the affirmative here today. But secondly, the next voter for you here today is hate crimes. You can feel extremely comfortable voting on this because the only response you're getting here is that, oh, hate crimes are subjective. Like what one person thinks is a hate crime, another person might not be. But Judge, my sources are literally telling you what a hate crime is or what a hate crime isn't. And my opponent tries to say like, oh, like saying someone's pronouns wrong. Obviously, that's not what we're talking about when we're saying hate crimes. We're talking about actual violence, which is what my sources are telling you about. Don't let my opponent give you this like loose response, because that's just not going to stand when the sources are clearly telling you that advocacy from political figures indeed does work in tangible ways. But the third place you can feel comfortable voting on is discriminatory behavior. This sub-point, again, literally goes unaddressed. If you look at your flow, there's nothing there. So that all is going to flow through. You're going to be buying that when public figures speak out against injustices, this reduces discriminatory behavior by 23%. And then, so Judge, when you're evaluating today's round, you're going to be seeing that the affirmative is so far ahead on this idea of quality of life for the most amount of people, and for that reason, I urge you to cast your ballot for the affirmative here today.
Hello.
Don't worry about it.
With you taking pictures in round?
Yeah.